Mark Carney capitulated and dropped the digital services tax.
We can handle Donald Trump.
Canada pauses new tariff threats as Trump escalates.
We can handle Donald Trump.
He removed many retaliatory tariffs.
We can handle Donald Trump.
Ladies and gentlemen, this broke today. Trade negotiations revive proposed steel and aluminum exports quota in return for lower U.S. tariffs.
We can handle Donald Trump.
Mark Carney promised that he would handle Donald Trump. That Canada would respond to Trump's steel tariffs with strength. But every time that threat was tested, he folded his cards. Now, after a year of intensifying trade talks, Carney's new negotiating strategy seems to be capitulation and then asking for something in return. This is the master negotiator. Let's take a look. Ladies and gentlemen, this broke today. Trade negotiations revive proposed steel and aluminum exports quota in return for lower U.S. tariffs. Trade negotiators are reviving a proposal that would see Canadian steel and aluminum exports subject to a quota system in return for lower U.S. levies on the metals as the clock ticks down on President Donald Trump's next round of tariffs. Intergovernmental Affairs Minister Dominic LeBlanc and Janice Charest, Canada's chief negotiator, jetted to Washington on Tuesday for the second time in as many weeks as the pressure ramps up to make a breakthrough in stalled trade talks. Their schedule this week includes meeting with U.S. industry groups that support the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, or USMCA, as well as sitting down with senators, one Canadian official told the Globe and Mail. It was unclear whether Mr. LeBlanc would meet with U.S. Trade Representative Jamieson Greer, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, or any other members of the Trump administration. One key to the discussions, according to 4 industry and 2 governmental sources, is a plan under which Canadian metals shipments to the U.S. would be limited in exchange for Mr. Trump reducing his 50% tariffs on them, similar to a proposal on the table last fall. The Globe is not identifying the sources because they were not authorized to reveal details of the top secret negotiations. The U.S. also enumerated some 24 other demands, including more access to Canada's protected dairy market, an end to provincial governments retaliating against Mr. Trump's tariffs by banning U.S. liquor, and the scrapping of the Online Streaming Act. Canada has made a string of preemptive concessions to Mr. Trump, such as killing a planned digital services tax and rolling back a Canadian content levy on streaming companies, but trade talks have remained at an impasse. Ottawa has resisted striking a punitive trade deal with Washington similar to those agreed to last year by Britain and Japan without some tariff relief. The White House, meanwhile, has refused to ease the trade war without more concessions, including stopping any retaliation against the tariffs. But Mr. Trump's plan, unveiled last month, to hit an additional $20 billion worth of Canadian exports, which 50% tariffs starting August 19th, lit a fire under Ottawa, according to 2 Canadian government sources and 1 U.S. industry source. Now the 2 sides have gone back to a proposal they were discussing last October when Mr. Trump abruptly ended talks over an Ontario government anti-tariff act. Can you see all the inaccuracies in this article up to this point, folks? We continue. Under the framework, Canadian steel and aluminum would be subject to tariff rate quotas, or TRQs, the sources said. This would mean that only a certain amount of the Canadian metals could be exported to the U.S. before an exorbitant tariff would take effect. 2 U.S. industry sources said negotiators are still haggling over what the quotas should be, and, in the case of steel, whether there should also be a lower tariff on steel sold below the quota. In exchange, Canada would see Mr. Trump's metal tariffs imposed under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 reduced for exports under the quota limit. Such an agreement could help achieve Canada's central negotiating goal of easing the pain for key industrial sectors while breaking the logjam on other trade issues. The Globe reported last fall that the proposed deal on steel would have seen a quota based on a historical level of metal shipments to the U.S. Inside the quota, steel would have faced a tariff in the range of 10 to 15%. Outside the quota, steel shipments would have faced tariffs in the 25 to 50% range. Two Canadian industry sources said that in addition to the formal negotiating sessions Mr. LeBlanc and Mr. have been holding with Mr. Greer, Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mr. Trump have been talking directly. Despite the more intensive trade talks, major hurdles remain. One Canadian industry and one Canadian government source said the other major economic sector hammered by Mr. Trump's Section 232 tariffs, autos, has not been the subject of detailed negotiations. In congressional testimony last month, Mr. Greer said discussions about rules of origin and other structural changes to the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, potentially including the auto sector, would likely continue into 2027. Canadian-made autos are subject to a 25% tariff. Okay, folks, we had to get through all of that context. But in part of that context, there was some definite errors in the reporting by the Globe and Mail. So number one, they said that, or implied, that Donald Trump in the United States is bringing up dairy as a new grievance. But as we've talked about before on Northern Perspective, this goes back to right after the original USMCA was actually signed, when Canada actually violated the USMCA in preventing access to American dairy producers to the Canadian dairy market. Now, whether or not you agree with that doesn't really matter. That's what was agreed to by Justin Trudeau and the previous Liberal government, and then acted in bad faith when the US actually couldn't get access to the Canadian dairy market. And that actually remains the case to this day. So this isn't something that's new. So that's the first part. The second part is they said that Donald Trump broke off negotiations because of the Ford ad. Well, in our interview with Ambassador P. Kotstra, he said that they didn't walk away from the deal at all, which seems to be what a lot of other people are telling us as well. So it wasn't the US that walked away from that deal. That was the Canadian government. Now, we're seeing some interesting but frankly embarrassing moves now by Mark Carney. But I want to just remind everybody, when it came to Canadian steel and Canadian aluminum, before this trade war with Donald Trump, our steel and aluminum was not tariffed at all. There was a brief period where there were some tariffs in the first Trump administration, but after USMCA came into effect, they were not tariffed. Now they are. And Mark Carney's strategy is, okay, well, we will take one for the team again. So we will say, yes, we're going to accept the 10 to 15% tariffs on steel and aluminum. And we are going to put in quotas. Pardon me? So not only are you going to accept tariffs, you're going to put a quota. And what this means, folks, is, let's say the quota is what? Just for number's sake, $100 million worth of steel. That's a lot of steel. And any steel sent from Canada or Canadian companies over the US, that would be subject to a 10 to 15% tariff. Anything that goes over that, so let's say the Canadian steel industry blows through that and is now up to 200 million in Canadian steel going over to the US. So that any extra dollar over 100 million would then be subject to a 25 to 50% tariff. You are effectively capping our steel industry exports to the United States. What are you doing, Mr. Carney? And I'm not the only one that is asking, what are you doing? Because the steel industry was asking, what is Mark Carney doing over a year ago? And let's just remind everybody how we got here. Canada will hike US steel tariffs if it can't make a trade deal next month, Carney says. This is by the CBC, folks. So, Mr. Carney, I'm going to handle Donald Trump. We're going to put tariffs on US steel. Here we go.
We can handle Donald Trump.
June 27th, 2025. Canada's steel producers tell government its tariff protection measures aren't enough. Canadian steel industry representatives told government officials in a meeting this week that their measures to protect the industry from the consequences of U.S. tariffs are insufficient. Two of the representatives who attended the meeting told Reuters. On Thursday, steel producers met with Patrick Haley, Assistant Deputy Minister for Trade and Finance, and other officials from the ministry, telling them the measures announced earlier this month do not protect the industry from steel dumping and could cause mass layoffs, the representative said.
We can handle Donald Trump.
The Liberals said that they're going to implement the digital services tax. Then negotiations broke off because the U.S. said, what are you doing? We're in the middle of negotiations and you want to put a digital services tax on here? That's not going to happen. No deal. Goodbye. So then Mark Carney capitulated and dropped the digital services tax, and this was announced on June 30th of 2025.
We can handle Donald Trump.
Not even 2 weeks later, on July 11th, Canada pauses new tariff threats as Trump escalates. So remember that threat of implementing tariffs on U.S. steel. If we don't get a deal by July 21st, Mr. Carney was handling Donald Trump. So 10 days before Mark Carney's own deadline, he says, well, maybe we're not going to actually put new tariffs on there because Donald Trump is threatening more on us.
We can handle Donald Trump.
Then, on August 22nd of 2025, not only did Mark Carney not put the new tariffs on American steel coming into Canada, what he did do is he removed many retaliatory tariffs on U.S. products.
We can handle Donald Trump.
You can't make this up, folks. And what did Carney get in response? Nothing. He didn't get anything in return. Goes on to say, Canada will remove many retaliatory import tariffs on U.S. goods and intensify talks with the United States. Wait a minute. August 22nd, 2025. After this is blowing up in Mark Carney's face, he's effectively not handling Donald Trump. He's capitulating on multiple aspects of this. So his response is, don't worry, Canada, we're going to intensify talks. Where have I heard that before? Oh, right. Now, Carney says he will intensify trade talks with Trump. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not August 22nd of 2025. This is July 21st of 2026.
We can handle Donald Trump.
So this is Mark Carney. He doesn't know what to do, so now he's in this loop. Everything is going to hell in a handbasket with these negotiations. He's not handling Donald Trump. He's not even really been doing anything with Donald Trump, aside from making snippy comments to reporters that are asking him, when are you talking to him? And he says, who cares? And in response, he says, don't worry, we're going to intensify talks. And the media eats it up. The media doesn't seem to understand that this is what he said a year ago, almost to the day when this happened. And what are they going to do? Is he going to get a tariff-free deal on steel and aluminum for Canada? Doesn't sound like it. Sounds like he's the one going to Donald Trump with hat in hand, saying, please, Mr. Trump, effectively control and manage the supply of our steel industry coming into your country. What is going to happen? You basically said, well, when it comes to the steel industry, now we have a hard ceiling of the amount of companies and the amount of steel that we can actually make. So there's going to be no growth for Canadian steel when it comes to the U.S. market, which is the easiest market to access. Ladies and gentlemen, when it comes to negotiating, Mark Carney said, I know how he negotiates. Well, just for the sake of argument, I'll believe you. I will believe you. And he said, I've worked with Donald Trump. I'll believe you. But here's the issue with me believing you. Here's the issue with that being true. That makes your performance even worse. It would be one thing if you said, well, I've never done business with Donald Trump, but I'm going to commit to negotiating and I'm going to commit to getting a deal for Canada. That's one thing. But to come up with all this bluster and say that you can handle him, you've negotiated with him, you know how he negotiates, you know how he operates, and you're effectively going to school him, that makes your performance embarrassing. And it's embarrassing for Canadians across this country. But it's also a tragedy for the tens of thousands of Canadians that are losing their jobs. Over 60,000 manufacturing jobs have disappeared in recent months because Mark Carney has refused to negotiate with Donald Trump. And it sounds like that's going to get worse. If this capitulation actually goes through, what does that mean for our steel industry? It means a lot of bad news, folks. What does it mean for Hamilton, where a lot of people, thousands of people, are employed by the local steel industry? What does it mean for Algoma Steel, who've already laid off a whole bunch of people? These companies need answers to these questions, and they need answers as to why you would submit to a quota to cap the industry just to try and get lower tariffs. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Mark Carney. It's not me making this up. It's not conservatives making this up. It's not even Donald Trump saying it. This is the mainstream media reporting on what's going on. And we've walked you through of the mainstream media reporting on Mark Carney's capitulations. The only thing that he managed to get from Donald Trump over that whole time is back to negotiating table. That's it. And what did he give up for that? He gave away the digital services task that they were going to implement in the middle of this. The mainstream media would have you believe that all of these things that Mark Carney did or was going to do should have been part of like the larger issue. But here's the thing, like when you're going into this and you already have the US tariffing you to hell and back, then you antagonize them more. And then when they say don't do that, you say, oh well, you know, you're increasing your demands. Well, yeah, because you're introducing new irritants. Why would they not ask for those irritants to go away? If it were the other way around, we'd be doing the same thing. So this spin that is trying to make Mark Carney completely absolvent of all responsibility in this is just crazy. And we've said it before. Donald Trump shouldn't be tariffing Canada. Period. We're their best trading partner. But this is what we have to deal with. And we're supposed to have a master negotiator, a master businessman on our side. And if this is what a master negotiator is, Mark Carney, maybe Canadians should just tell you to please stop. Maybe send in Freeland, because she at least got a deal.